Awesome. Yay. Okay, great. So awesome. So great. And I'm just going to briefly introduce Cynthia. Cynthia is Professor Emeritus from Boston College, and she's going to be talking tonight about the title of the talk is Little Russia and the Russian Empire, History and the War in Ukraine. So given Cynthia's knowledge and expertise in this field, as a former professor, we're really looking forward to getting to hear from her and to learning a little bit more about just some of the cultural background and knowledge about what's happening in the war of Ukraine right now. So great. Great. So I think I will hand it off to Cynthia.
Okay, thank you. As Sam said, I'm a retired professor from Boston College. I wanted to take care of some specifics, first of all, for those of you who saw the announcement. I am what is called a Slavist. I was a professor of Slavic Studies at Boston College. And although I did teach courses in the history department, and I do history in parts of my research, I'm not a trained historian. I am a Slavist, a specialist on the Soviet Union, Russia, and at the other end of the Slavic world, former Yugoslavia and the successor states of Yugoslavia. So that is my area of expertise. But nonetheless, I'm going to be talking about Ukrainian history today. And I, over the years, have had to learn more about Ukrainian history because it was not the history that I learned as a child of the Cold War. I learned Russian history simply. But I want to speak, what my plan is to speak first of all about history long ago, the bygone years, and history more contemporary from the Russian perspective and from the Ukrainian perspective, because one thing about history that we've learned for decades now, even in the 20th century, is that history is not static. It changes with the context and with more knowledge and with various perspectives. So we now engage in revisionist history, and history is simply not the history of the victors. So that is what history is now. And so it's very important history matters, and it matters to some more than others. But it's important to note that we need to view history from varying perspectives. Certainly history, all history, Russian history, is important to Vladimir Putin. And so the question today will be, what about history for Ukrainians, and what about their history? So what I would like to do is I'm going to transition to a map of a contemporary map of the region, and I will talk about history using that map. And then after the main part of that, I'll come back for just some concluding remarks. So I'm going to be a little block off to the side of my map. So let me do this. Okay. Okay. I hope that is what does everybody see the map now? Okay, and my cursor. Good. All right. So before I even begin the history, and I'm sure many of you have spent some time now looking at this map, but the first thing I'm sure that most people notice is how large Ukraine is. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, only smaller than the European part of Russia. And it has been the breadbasket of Europe throughout its history. It is a very fertile place, especially southern Ukraine, the steppes of Ukraine. And also, I think you will notice that by virtue of its position, it is at a crossroads. It was over the centuries, a crossroads between trading routes from Northern Europe, Sweden, Norway, probably up to northern Russia, around the location of St. Petersburg today, Ladoga, down through, as you can see, Kiev, down to the south to what was Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, today Istanbul. And certainly I don't need to explain its significance east to west in Europe. So Ukraine is very much like a former country that I really have spent decades studying, and that is the former Yugoslavia, a similar position in the Balkans, a place that was colonized again and again subject to the wars between great powers. And there is very much a similarity with what's going on today with what went on in the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and particularly the center of Yugoslavia, which was Bosnia, where people said, like Putin says today, the Ukrainians don't exist. They haven't been free. And that's one thing that we'll be talking about. It doesn't matter if a region or a people are colonized throughout time. Ask them if they have a shared culture, language, traditions. They can have a feeling of nationality. So that's very important to keep in mind. But ancient history. Putin is very interested in ancient history, or I'd say the tale of bygone years. Kiev, right here. That's the Ukrainian pronunciation, which we now know, was the locale of the first political organization of the Eastern Slavs, the Eastern Slavs. The White Russians, Bieli is white in Russian, so White Russia, Ukraine, and Russia are the East Slavic nations. This is the Slavic diaspora. Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, these are the West Slavic nations, and to come down through Slovenia, Croatia, now the 6 nations that have formed in former Yugoslavia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Bulgaria are the South Slavic nations. So many people don't know that the Slavs are the largest ethnicity in Europe. Again, things that aren't have to do with power, right? So Kiev. Now, Kievan Rus existed between the 9th and the 12th centuries. And its greatest leader is someone that you may have heard of, who is Saint Vladimir or Saint Volodymyr. And immediately would come to mind, if you've been following the news, that Zelensky's first name is Volodymyr and Putin's first name is Vladimir. This follows a Russian tradition of naming your children after saints. That's why Russians all have so many of the same names, ethnic Russians. Zelensky is Jewish, and yet he was named Volodymyr. So right away, it tells you there's something about Vladimir or Volodymyr, which is more important than his sainthood. He is the greatest leader of the Slavs in antiquity, or the bygone years. Much that we know about Vladimir in this period of time comes from chronicles. And the most significant chronicle for Russian history is the Rus primary chronicle, or the tale of bygone years, which is why I keep using that phrase. It's part legendary, but I remember as a student of Russian history that it was amusing when we started studying the Kievan Rus, because the story goes that the warring grand princes of the Eastern Slavs couldn't make peace with each other. So to have a peaceful political entity, they invited Varangians, who are Vikings, who are Norsemen from Norway, from this region up here, who came down this way. And these brothers came to Kiev, and they moved throughout the territories, but the one who won out was Vladimir. And was Rurik. And Rurik was the first leader of Kievan Rus. So that the dynasty that ruled in Kievan Rus, and then later in Muscovy, or the first Russia, were descendants of this Rurik. How much of this is legend is disputable. However, there was definitely a Nordic influence on the Russian territories, and there are many archaeological monuments and so on, and such to prove that. But that is some interesting fact some interesting belief, at least, that the Russians were first brought into nationhood, if you will, by Norsemen, the Vikings. So to go forward, though, to Vladimir. Vladimir, this leader, he ruled, by the way, from 980 to 1015. He is also significant. You notice he has sainthood because he Christianized the Slavs, the Russians, you should say the East Slavs. He accepted Christianity, my cursor gets lost, through the monks from Constantinople, through the Christians of the East, who would soon be separated. So he is a saint, and he is renowned as the Christianizer of the Slavs. So orthodoxy, autocracy, these are some of the important values, would say, of the Russian Empire. So a little bit of an aside is that these are things that all come together over time about Putin and Putin's vision. In 2016, Putin had erected across from the Kremlin in Moscow a statue to Saint Vladimir. And the received thought was that, well, his name is Vladimir, and this is Saint Vladimir, and it is a kind of aggrandizement, a self-aggrandizement, just as he uses the double-headed eagle of the Russian Empire. But it is obviously more than that. Putin wants to draw the direct line of Russian history, as I learned it from Soviet emigre historians, from Moscow through Kiev, down through Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, and wants to reestablish this idea that was really popularized in the 19th century of Moscow as the third Rome, as the seat of Christianity. There is Rome, Rome falls. There is Byzantium, Constantinople, they fall. Moscow inherits the seat of Christianity. So again, Putin's vision is of the bygone years, not just the Russian Empire, but the bygone years, in fact. Another important fact is that when Kiev fell, and it fell to the Mongols in 1240, for 3 centuries, Ukraine, the ethnic territory of Ukraine, was divided among the Mongols at first in the south, the Tatars, then the Lithuanians conquered them, then the Poles and the Lithuanians with their Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. For 3 centuries, Ukraine, the peasants lived as farmers and fed all of these territories. They were not independent. But one thing that they didn't do, and this is what Ukrainian historians have emphasized, and in the 10-volume history of Ukraine that was written in the early 20th century, it was emphasized that Kiev, or Ukraine, after the fall of Kiev and Rus, identified more with Galicia, and that's where Lviv is, Galicia, and the principality here, and then until it fell to the Poles, and then for 100 years, and then to southern Ukraine. And what was happening in southern Ukraine? This is the land of the Cossacks. And Kazakh is Cossack in Ukrainian and Russian, and Cossack means free man or adventurer. And the origin of the Cossacks is of Ukrainians, if you will, who would gather in the particular times of the year to hunt and fish. It was kind of like a guy's adventure. And over time, others joined them. Peasants from the northern regions who escaped serfdom would come to southern Ukraine, and noblemen who were looking for adventure would come. And over time, the inhabitants of what became the Cossack territory became more and more permanent until it actually formed a political unit. And I need to check my dates here. By the 16th century, the Cossacks were mentioned in the 15th century. By the 16th century, they had formed a political unit. Interestingly enough, the Cossacks had a general assembly, and it was called the Rada. And if you've listened and heard in the news, you know that the parliament of Ukraine is called the Verkhovna Rada, the high parliament. They also elected a leader, a hetman, and this unit was called the hetmanate. And when Ukraine joined the Russian Empire, which it did of its own free will, at first, these hetmanates existed within the Russian Empire, the settlements of the Cossacks, the Ukrainian Cossacks, and there were several of them. So the Cossacks were actually the ones who liberated Ukraine from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And they did that in 1648, the 17th century, in a rebellion led by a Cossack. And in 6 short years after that, the Cossacks signed an agreement, a treaty, with the Russian Empire, according to which they were to maintain sovereignty. That was never realized. So that the date when this treaty of Khmelnytsky, the leader of the Cossacks at the time, signed, is now considered a day of sorrow in Ukraine, because they did not remain sovereign. And for the rest of their time, except for a brief time in the early 20th century, 1918 to 22, they were subject, at least the central and eastern part was subject to the Russian Empire. Not all of Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire. Eastern Ukraine, Galicia, remained under the rule of Poland. And this accounts for the great diversity across Ukraine, because they belonged in the 19th century to two separate empires. First, of course, the Poles, but eventually the Habsburgs, then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this was the situation in the 20th century. Nonetheless, to say that the Ukrainians felt that they were part of Russia is to definitely overstate the reality of this history. So if we take it up to the 20th century, I want to say a bit more about a more recent history, or 20th century history, and how important that is to Ukrainians. If we turn to Putin, and the decision to invade Ukraine was Putin's. It was not a strategic decision or a geopolitical decision of if any merit, as people are talking about now. So I talk about Putin. I don't talk about Russian or the Russian people, where I will talk about the Ukrainians, not Zelensky. So what is important to Putin? Putin did not experience the Second World War. He was born after the war, but his parents did. He was born in Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. His father fought against the Nazis, was severely wounded. His mother survived, but his 2-year-old brother perished. 1.5 million people, mainly women and children, died in Leningrad during the siege of Leningrad. He would have sat at the table with his family and relatives hearing about the betrayal of Germany. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939. 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Putin, by the way, blames the West for for Stalin's decision to sign this non-aggression pact. And it's much more complicated. Not just that France and Great Britain had not decided in 1939 who they would protect, who they would go to war for in face of Hitler's aggression. But while these negotiations were going nowhere, Stalin signed this non-aggression pact with Germany. And part of that non-aggression pact was Germany and the Soviet Union's decision to partition Europe into spheres of influence. And under the spheres of influence for the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union would get back Galicia, for instance, get back this part and part of Poland, the partitioning of Poland. They agreed to aggression from East and West. So Putin's assertion that the West is to blame for the 2 years that the Soviet Union fought with the Nazis is incorrect. Of course, it is again much more complicated than that. After the Soviet Union was invaded in 1941, the Soviet Union became a member of the Allies. But that notion of the suffering of the Second World War and of betrayal of the West it drives Putin. It may have been why he joined the KGB. He was an officer in the KGB, stationed in Dresden in East Germany in 1989, in the 80s. In 1989, he witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. He called for the Soviet Union to intervene, to put out the protests that were happening in Dresden as well. And Moscow did not answer. He was powerless to do anything as a KGB agent in Dresden in East Germany at that time. So for Putin, the fall of the wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, World War II, these are the grievances he takes, he bears. And it's odd. perhaps the wealthiest man in the entire world, isolated as he is, carries these grievances. Oh, excuse me, I just did what I was afraid that I would do. Just a moment. That's it. Hold on. Okay, and this. There we go. I don't see myself right now, but I guess I will eventually. So, and I wanted to just show you, I just wanted you to see that, the Second World War scenario as well. I think, however, I will actually, am I still on?
I don't see, I don't know if you're trying to share the map again. I'm just seeing.
I am not. Here I am. I am going to close, excuse me, I'm going to close my PowerPoint. I lost you behind there we go. Is everything okay now?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, so I don't need the map. So, but I wanted to bring you up to World War II with the map. But if we go to Ukraine in World War II, or simply recent history in Ukraine, what is important for Ukraine in more recent history, if not lived? We might say 1932 to 1933. That is the famine in, it's called in Ukrainian Holodomor, if you've heard that word. That was a famine that Stalin himself created, in part to punish Ukrainians because they were very resistant to collectivization in the first 5-year plan, 1928 to 1933, but also to steal the grain from the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, to feed Russians, and also to sell abroad, to get some profit during this worldwide depression. 3.9 million Ukrainians died in the Holodomor. So if that is not lived history from the World War II, it is definitely part of what Ukrainians are asked to remember, at least. If we go to World War II, that's much more problematic. And that is a history that the Ukrainians were really beginning to delve into up into this war. And that is the fact that when Hitler invaded Ukraine, there were Ukrainian nationalists, because there had been throughout this time, throughout all the period of Soviet domination, nationalist movements and some rebellions. But at the start of World War II, there were Ukrainians who believed that their fate would be better with Hitler than, and perhaps they were promised, the details of it. I have not studied, but they thought that their fate would be better with Hitler. And some of them not only joined Hitler's forces, but they were part of execution squads, and they executed Jews. And 1.5 million Jews died in Ukraine, and some of them at the hands of Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians. That is that kind of reassessment of one's history that has been going on throughout Europe over time, more or less. And that will still be part of Ukrainian national identity, to deal with that. And to understand that, I do have to mention, and I didn't when we had the map, the Pale of Settlement. Under the Russian Empire in 1791, Catherine the Great established the Pale of Settlement for Jews in the Russian Empire. It was partly in Ukraine. It was Belarus today, part of Moldova, and in Moldova. And so throughout the history of Ukraine, as much as we talk about the fact that its idea of nationality could be ethnic at the turn of the 20th century, it was still the Pale of Settlement for Jews in the Russian Empire. So anti-Semitism and problems that arise are something that must always be dealt with. And finally, Chernobyl. Chernobyl, 1983, or was it 86, I think? Yeah, I got that right. My dates, I always get that very confused. But nonetheless, Chernobyl is an hour and a half north of Kiev. And although the area of radiation spread into Belarus and into Russia, this is considered a Ukrainian tragedy. And if you've watched the documentaries or even the feature film, you know that the cause for the Chernobyl disaster is attributed to faulty Soviet engineering and a lack of training and commitment on the part of the staff in Chernobyl. So Ukrainians carry their own grievances of of a different sort. But how much of this history, either the history of the bygone years or contemporary history, is really important today for the notion of a nation, and how much of it underlies what's going on today? I would say for Vladimir Putin, a great deal. The history of bygone years and the contemporary history of the Soviet Union and these grievances, I should say, and then that I actually see that Susan Thanos has a raised hand. I'll be with you in a moment, Susan. But there are some people who know Russia. And if you knew Russia in the Soviet period and you went there as I did, you would know that, you would have seen that, or if you study political posters, you would have seen that the Soviets had 4 boogeymen. And the boogeymen were Uncle Sam, and he had that caricature, that character with the striped pants and whatever. The capitalist, with the tall hat carrying the money bag. NATO, where you would have seen animated jet planes attacking Russia, and the Nazis. This was kept alive. World War II was kept alive. That enemy that really brought unity to the Soviet Union, this multi-ethnic place. So, history is certainly important to Putin, and he was raised with that notion of enemies, and he operates on that notion. How much that kind of history is important for young Russians who are suffering, along with all of Russians today, we will see. And I'm sure everybody has been watching the brave people of the media, or those who have fled, who are searching their souls about the fact that they have fled Russia when Russia needs them, these people who are oriented toward democracy. But what I really want to speak about is history and Ukrainians. And I've talked to you about what might be important for Ukrainians today in history. What has happened in Ukraine, which is a multi-ethnic country, large multi-ethnic country for Europe, of varying ethnicities and histories, where even if you talk about a Slavic Ukrainian ethnicity, which is the majority, that is described by the boundaries of present-day Ukraine, those boundaries that were drawn in the early 20th century by the first historian of Ukraine, and by what became the Ukrainian SSSR, the Ukrainian Republic, after Ukraine, well, you joined the Soviet Union in 1922, or lost to the Bolsheviks after World War I. Nonetheless, what was really a country searching for identity has an identity today more than it has ever had. And if you to read, there are wonderful historians of Ukraine, like Serhiy Plokhy from the Harvard Ukrainian Russian Research Center, or Timothy Snyder, who is specialized on Ukraine, but has written, for instance, Bloodlands, about the suffering in that territory between Hitler and Stalin. These are wonderful historians. But what they will tell you is, thank you, Putin, because today, Ukrainians know who they are. And I guess my parting words are about identity. And a sociologist colleague taught me how to teach about identity, which is very useful, I think, which is identity as a hierarchy of salient features. So if you want to know who someone is, just ask them. They'll tell you who they are. You might ask yourself, who are you? And for Ukrainians before this war, I posit that if you had asked a Ukrainian, who are you, they might say, I'm an engineer, or I'm a mother, or I am an Orthodox Christian. Today, if you ask a Ukrainian who they are, they'll tell you, I'm a Ukrainian. Number one, I'm a Ukrainian. And it doesn't matter if you're a Jew, or if you're Christian, or whether you come from Galicia, which was under Western rule, or Central or Eastern Ukraine. And what does that mean to them? Ukrainians have proved who they are. They have fought in 2 revolutions. They have fought the Orange Revolution against a voter fraud, you might say, and they have fought the Maidan in 2014 against the betrayal they would see by the then President Yanukovych, who leaned toward Moscow, but who was prepared, because of what Ukrainians desired, to form a an agreement, agreement of association with the EU, and then never signed it. And that was the impetus for the Maidan revolution of 2014. They've already taken to the streets. They have already fought for what they consider is their nation. And what do they mean by being a Ukrainian? They, in those revolutions or demonstrations, they have made it very clear that they believe that to be Ukrainian is to have self-determination, to decide what kind of government they have, to aspire to the aspirational values of the EU. And among those are democratic values as they see them, and a market economy free of corruption. And today, thanks to Putin, Ukrainians will know who they are, and they know what they want, and it will be, and historians and those who really know Ukrainian on the ground say they will not be conquered. So I guess, thank you, and that's what I have to say about the importance of history.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was really enlightening, and we really appreciate your knowledge in this area and your ability to share that with us. I see, I think we have a question here in the Q&A. But if folks have more questions, this will be the question portion of the event. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them either in the chat or the Q&A. I'll see both of them, and then I can read them out to Cynthia. And for anyone in the room, if you have a question, you can say it to me, and then I'll repeat it back to Cynthia. Jill asks, what year is represented on the map? Or what year is that map from?
That I assume is a current map. And because I looked to see, whatever, looked for the dissolution of Yugoslavia, or I looked for things that would indicate. I took the map that did not have copyright from the internet.
Sure. Great. Yeah, thank you. I guess the question.
And let me say that it also showed, that map also showed Crimea as being part of Ukraine. It's interesting. I spent one night in my 4-year-old grandson's room, and there on the wall is a map of Europe. And I go to the map and I think, well, it must have been produced in China, because there Crimea belongs to Russia by color.
Oh, yeah, that's I've heard that, so many folks can really pinpoint a year if they see like a globe or a map or something based on those different distinctions and such, and it can be really in some cases easy to pinpoint like a decade or even a precise year or something like that. That's great. Okay, so I'm seeing some questions here in the chat. Someone asks, what is your take on the Nazi party in Ukraine? Azov? I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, I am very glad that question was asked, because I meant to touch upon it. Because as you know, the propaganda, that question comes from someone who has heard of the Russian propaganda that Russia invaded Ukraine to protect the ethnic Russians of Eastern Ukraine against Nazi genocide. He takes that from this World War II era, when Ukrainians, some nationalists, did fight with the execution units of the Nazi army. There are neo-Nazis, as there are neo-Nazis everywhere, but that is not his point of reference. It is World War II.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Paul asks, what is Putin's goal for this war?
I don't know. People don't know Putin's goal. I think people talk more, specialists, and really political scientists who consider how this war might end. How will this war end? Putin will get some of the things that he wants. And Ukraine, this is just from my reading and my understanding of what will happen. Putin will get Crimea. The world will recognize Crimea as a part of Russia, even though, as you would have seen on the map, Crimea is joined by land to Ukraine. Now it's joined by the longest bridge to Russia that an oligarch built. But Eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, differs from Crimea in an important way, in that in Crimea, the majority population is ethnic Russian. In the Donbass, Eastern Ukraine, the majority ethnicity is actually Ukrainian. So Russia's claim on Eastern Ukraine, Russia's claim on Eastern Ukraine has something to do with the ethnic Russians that live there. But if we're talking about simply majority, they are ethnic Ukrainian. And I also wanted, what I didn't touch upon too is language. In those, Ukrainian and Russian are distinct languages. I can decipher some Ukrainian written. I cannot understand a word of it. And a friend of mine who now lives in Croatia sent me a postcard that I sent her in 1969 when I was in Kiev. And I said in it, they speak Ukrainian here. I can't understand a word of it. So it's a distinctive language, and it separated itself over 300 years of separation from Russia. But there are Russian speakers who moved to that territory for various reasons. Certainly in the Soviet period, it was one republic of Russia, and Eastern Ukraine was the manufacturing belt of Ukraine. So people moved there for jobs, and there were periods of Russification. And I was surprised myself in reading around to learn that in the last years of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union was the non-Russian portions of the Soviet Union were more Russified than they had been at any time in their history, which I would have thought it had been different through de-Stalinization and all that sort of thing. So Ukrainians, most of them speak Russian. Russians don't necessarily speak Ukrainian. So speaking Russian in Eastern Ukraine is really also not any reason to claim that it has more affinity with Russia. And ultimately, as I mentioned, it doesn't matter. The people of that territory get to decide, what their political organization will be.
Great, thank you. I'm just, I think we have a question here in the room. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure.
Great.
This is not the first time that Russia has invaded the Ukraine. Is that correct?
Well, Ukraine was a republic of the Soviet Union from 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic.
When did they become autonomous?
Well, they were, Putin says never, but they were, of course, as I mentioned, autonomous as a city-state way back when, in the 12th century. They were free. They declared their independence in 1918 after World War I, and for 4 years they were independent until they fell to the Bolsheviks, because Russia, after the fall of the Russian Empire, remember, the end of World War II is the fall of 4 empires. So the Russian Empire fell and the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell. Ukraine declared its independence and existed for 4 years until they were defeated by the Bolsheviks in the civil war that was going on in the Russian territory and into the Slavic territory. So for 4 years. And then again in 1991. In 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, some attribute Ukraine to Ukraine, the fall of the Soviet Union. Another grievance probably of Putin's, because they declared their independence. And then that started, the ball rolling for the end of the Soviet Union. I mean, there were other things going on, but in 1991, since 1991. I wanted to say one, I didn't finish, but how will this war end? So I'm saying I think that Putin will get Eastern Ukraine. I think he will get Eastern Ukraine. He will get Crimea. He will get either a a commitment in writing that Ukraine will not join NATO. And I was of the school, and most people of my Cold War generation were of the school, that there never should have been NATO expansion, that this was pushing NATO to the doors of Russia with all their grievances about World War II, absorbing all of Eastern Europe, the Eastern Bloc. All the countries of the Eastern Bloc are in NATO now. But all I have to say to that is, of course, when Putin invaded Ukraine, that idea was off the table. Nonetheless, non-NATO membership, and Ukraine could establish itself as a non-aligned nation. Yugoslavia was a non-aligned nation, and it benefited greatly. It took aid, and they will need a lot of aid to rebuild. Aid from the Soviet Union, they took aid from us, and they built at the same time, at that time, the existence of Yugoslavia, the largest armed forces in Europe. So I would imagine that non-NATO membership would have to be tied for Ukraine with the ability to not be neutral, to be able to have a military. So I would imagine that any specialist on the region would say that's how the war will end. Each of them will get something. So that's the end of that question.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump to the chat briefly because I see some questions in here, and then I'm going to go back to the Q&A. So someone asks, it's hard for us born after World War II to understand how a war that ended 80 years ago could be the impetus for this current Russian aggression. Why did Putin launch this war now at this particular moment? What has threatened him so badly in this moment now?
I think there, again, I'm not a political scientist, but I read a lot. And I think there were numerous factors. As I've told you, World War II was kept alive. In the Soviet Union, of course, the Soviet Union fell in 1991, and so many people who would be fighting this war weren't even alive then. But what the Soviet Union suffered more than the Allies, any country in the Allies by far, that is part of Russian history, and the Russian history that is taught. So that is one thing. World War II is important. But why now? There are various theories out there. I mean, the ultimate issue was that the Ukraine went after one of Putin's oligarch friends in Ukraine. But Putin has been building up to this for some time, and even a well-respected, I guess you would say he is a journalist, but a talking head, but very well versed in this history. His name is Anatoly Levin. Right before Putin invaded, he said, Putin has had grievances all this time, that every leader of Russia and the Soviet Union and Russia, including Yeltsin, including the transitional period, Gorbachev, all of them opposed NATO membership, NATO expansion for the Eastern Bloc, whatever. And Putin has had this grievance about Ukraine and the continuing, if not proffering, but talks about the relationship with NATO. No one would listen. And as Anatoly Levin said, it took stationing 190,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border for the West to wake up and start listening to Putin. I held that position too until he invaded. So again, why did he invade? I would say that he invaded because he is in great trouble. He is in great trouble, and I don't think anyone underestimates the value of waging war for bringing a nation together. It's done it for Ukraine, right? But what he drastically underestimated was the Ukrainians. The military buildup, which was he not aware of it, but simply not knowing Ukraine himself, being so isolated. And of course, he lives in a bubble and gets, now we say, probably bad information or not sufficient information. But I think it was to do something. And people talk about he's turning 70, he's interested in his legacy, he wants to reestablish the great Russia. I mean, all of those factors might play into it, I think, but Russia is in trouble. The oligarchs have stolen the nation's wealth. It is a fairly unmanageable, the biggest country in the world, country in any case. And Putin, if it's not his legacy, he needed to do something positive, and he thought this would be a positive thing. Yeah.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. One more question in the chat here. Before the Russian invasion, how did the Ukraine compare with Europe? And I think that's supposed to say the US in terms of economic and social development and modernization.
Well, there's a difference between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. The Donbass experienced what both Great Britain and the United States experienced in the loss of its industrial centers. Fiona Hill who is the the specialist on Russia, the Soviet Union and Russia, who testified in the first impeachment hearing. If you remember, this very remarkable Slavist, she's one of us. She's written a wonderful book in which she draws the parallel between what's happened in the Soviet Union, what's happened in the north of Great Britain, where the mines were, what happened is in the Rust Belt in the United States, and how that has fed populism, and this polarization in the political life of these countries. Well, the same thing happened in Ukraine. It's whatever you want to call northern England or Rust Belt was exactly the Donbass, with the loss, with the exporting of whatever steel, the making of steel and whatever under globalization has led to an impoverishment of that part of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine. Western Ukraine, the further you get west, it looks more like Western Europe. And I think in some areas, although I'm not a specialist on the economy of Ukraine, but it had a highly developed IT base, which has actually been very, very helpful in this time. But and I wouldn't say that Kyiv was thriving perhaps as much as Lviv, but I would say that it was doing relatively well, let's say, not being in the EU, but still being independent and finding pockets of power. And I think the IT world, I do know about that many companies worked in Ukraine with IT developers and that sort of thing. But again, they're better sources than I am for where they were at the start of the war.
Thank you. And you mentioned that book briefly. Do you know the title of that book?
You mean Fiona Hill's book?
Yes.
Well, as you talk, I'll check. I mean, I just read it.
I
read
can look.
It's one of those, recollect, to recall things. She's written. It's actually her memoir. It is.
Okay.
There's no place for you here. And I didn't have to look. I remembered. There's no place for you here, which comes from what her father told her, coming from she comes from the coal mining area of northern England. She is absolutely impoverished working class, and she ended up being a great scholar. But her father told her, "There's no place for you here." It's a wonderful memoir, and it tells you learn a lot about how the life she has lived, where she has been positioned, history. Her life has been the history of globalization and what it's meant for the rise of populism.
Thank you. And we have some questions. We have some questions here in the Q&A. But first, I'd like to ask, are there any other books or, I've been reading up, trying to, keep up with what's going on in the New York Times, but are there any other books or sources where people can learn more about this history, or books that you'd recommend?
What I just know the canonical books because they're the ones that I have read that I would go to first.
Okay.
So Timothy Snyder has written a book called Bloodlands, and it is about between Hitler and Stalin, and it's exactly this territory that suffered first the famines and then the Holocaust, because the victims of the Holocaust were the greatest numbers, of course, were not in Germany or even in Poland, but in this area that he describes. Serhii Plokhy, and that's Plohy, Ukrainian historian at Harvard, has written a tome, History of Ukraine, and many other books on Ukraine. Anne Applebaum has written a book called The Red Famine. I think it's called The Red Famine, and that is about the Holodomor in Ukraine. These are books for general readership. I'm not so sure about Plokhy's history; it's huge, but the others, they've been New York Times bestsellers and that sort of thing. They're readable if you're interested in that sort of thing.
Great, thank you. So in our last few minutes here, I'll try to read some of these questions here. Jeffrey asks, why did Khrushchev give Crimea to the Ukraine?
Okay, well, maybe I didn't explain that too well. Some people say it was a gift. No, I was going to say that. That's why I thought I had said it. It was in my mind. Khrushchev was Ukrainian. And so some say he gave it to Ukraine as a gift, in part as some kind of retribution, not retribution against the Soviet Union, but to acknowledge their suffering under Stalin. Khrushchev was involved in de-Stalinization. So part of de-Stalinization would be to try to make right some of Stalin's wrongs. And one was the Holodomor. So as a gift, as a Ukrainian, of Crimea to Ukraine, and also the topographical reality that Crimea is connected to Ukraine by land and not to the Russian SSSR territory.
Thank you. Bill asks, there are various views, conspiracy theories, that foreign entities, our CIA, Soros, etc., were the driving forces behind the 2014 revolution. Is there any evidence to this?
Poor George Soros. He really is. He's another boogeyman of Putin's. I have no, obviously, information about CIA sources, or I know George Soros as Open Society Fund, and what George Soros has done to support free media in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. Who knows? Does the United States, does the CIA still get involved in some way in supporting on the ground rebellions against autocratic rule or whatever, or corruption? In this case, it was, what do I say, reprisals against a leader who did not listen to his people in a supposed democracy. So I have no answer for that. But I can say, and I think we have seen, I think the proof in what is going on in Ukraine today is not CIA supported or inspired. This is Ukrainians telling the entire world that they will fight and die for Ukraine. So regardless, Ukrainians want independence and they want self-determination.
Great, thank you. Carol asks, is the greater impetus for Putin's aggression his fear of NATO/Western democracy, or the capture of Eastern Ukraine's resource wealth?
Well, Ukraine's considering the state of manufacturing and all of that and mining, Ukraine's Eastern resource wealth would be, of course, agricultural. Okay, so yes. Yes, he would like the breadbasket, obviously. So it's not, there isn't just one answer. Is he afraid of the democracy next door? That's what some people have said. He is fighting against the democracy next door. If it's what we say, an irony. If he says that Ukrainians are Russians, he must be then extremely concerned that some Russians live in democracy and other Russians live in autocracy. So I think both of those are reasons. NATO expansion it was a significant reality to feed Putin's paranoia. Absolutely. And I've been opposed to it from day one, from the fall of the Soviet Union. Of course, now people will say Putin has only given the counter argument to the way many specialists felt in the world of Slavic studies. Cold War people like myself said, NATO exists for protection against the Soviet Union in Western Europe. There is no Soviet Union. There is no need for NATO. Let's just have one big EU or something like that, right? Putin has, he has made real the counter argument, which is we need NATO because there will always be a Russia, a Soviet Union, and then a Russia, which is aggressive and has these hegemonic plans for all of Europe. So NATO expansion is one of those factors, but I guess I also wanted to say that he made it more of, I think I think I've gotten off course here with whether he feared NATO expansion. I think what he has proved is it's simply not a question of NATO expansion, because if he gets if not non-alignment status, he will still have a buffer, for Russia from NATO. But I think what he's seeing right now is NATO non-engagement. I mean, I think that we're seeing a lot of things. We'll see if this holds, and I'm sure all of us hope it does. But the conviction that NATO is not set on aggression, it is set on protection, so security.
Great, thank you so much. I think since we just have since we're approaching 7:30, I think that'll be the last question that we take here tonight. Well, thank you so much, Cynthia, for your time tonight with us and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise in this area. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm really grateful that we have folks in our community who are willing to share their knowledge with us, and I really appreciate your time tonight. So for folks watching, I'll be sending out a follow-up email, maybe tomorrow, maybe on Monday, realistically not sure, but with the recording of this presentation for folks who might like to revisit it or would like to share it with others. My name is Sam. I'm a librarian here at the Duxbury Library, and I just want to say thank you for everyone who joined us here tonight. If you have any future questions, you can give me a call at the library or send me an email. I think, I'll include my email in the follow-up email that I send out. But thank you everyone who joined us tonight, and thank you again to Cynthia for your time.
My pleasure, thank you.
Thank you. Great. Have a nice night, everyone. Thank you.
Everybody. Thank you, bye.